Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just encourage you to collect headsets if you're not fluent in both English and Spanish. You fine, Santiago? Yeah, I'll just wait for things to settle a bit at the back before I kick off. So I'm Shanaz Musa, a director at South South North. We're based in South Africa, and I'm the CEO of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. And it's really a privilege to be here today speaking to you all and with the esteemed panel as well. Our moderator will be Samson, a colleague, who will take over from me once I've done the introduction. So our event today is Unlocking Finance for Locally Led Climate Action, and it's a partnership between South South North, FLA, and GIAG. And we partners that often work, and so it's really nice to bring all of us together here to talk about an issue that's really topical both inside and outside of the negotiations. So I think by now we all realize that local-led climate action requires a significant increase in finance and changes to delivery mechanisms. And this includes making existing developments resilient. So in this event, we'd like to share with you strategies and examples from Africa, South Asia, and Latin America that talk to unlocking finance for gender-responsive, community-led adaptation. And I think the important thing to focus on here is that it's gender-responsive and community-led. Before I hand over for the session to begin, I'd just like to highlight the 4 objectives of the session so that we have this forward of mind when we're listening to our panelists. And the objectives include highlighting the importance of creating finance flows that put resources in the hands of communities for locally led climate action and resilience planning. And this action has to be gender responsive and socially inclusive. And then we'd like to showcase examples of solutions and strategies for driving finance to the ground for local action. And then thirdly, we'd like to put a spotlight on and give space to grassroots and community level voices on financing equitable local implementation. And then we'd like to initiate a dialogue between grassroots and community level actors with government and your finance and investment actors to foster collective learning and recommendations on how to finance and drive locally led adaptation in the global south. So with that objectives in mind, our panelists were chosen, and I'd like to hand over to my colleague Samson, who's going to moderate the event.
Thank you very much, Shanaz, for the welcome address. And it's essentially great to have everyone here. A very warm welcome to you all to this event on unlocking finance for locally led climate action. And as Shanaz mentioned, this event is co-hosted by South South North, FLA, and GIAG. Right. So also as Shanaz mentioned, my name is Samson Bewe, and I'm a technical program manager at South South North. And it is my pleasure to moderate this session today. So in terms of the format for this session, it's been designed in such a way that it will be interactive, and we'll have some interaction between the panelists and the audience. But first, I will give a bit of a short presentation just to give an idea on how we're going to frame this session and how we plan to have the panel discussion. And then we'll then proceed to have a discussion that will be somewhat moderated, and then thereafter we'll have a Q&A with the audience and the panelists. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity to hear from Dr. Shiraz Waji, whom I shall introduce a little later in the session. And he will provide an overview on the reflections of this section and some recommendations on how we could begin to think about unlocking finance for locally led climate action. And finally, Dr. Shanaz will do the closing. So, big question, what is financing locally led climate action? And obviously we can all agree that the impacts of climate change are growing in severity, disproportionately affecting poor people as well as vulnerable communities. And the key question is, how should financing adaptation be effective? I think it's important to continuously recognize that the impacts of climate change affect people in different ways. And among those that are marginalized are, in many cases, women and non-binary people that often face barriers, related very much to their norms, traditions, policies that continuously perpetuate these inequalities and structural historical imbalances. And obviously, recent evidence shows that less than 10% of finance from global funds flows to the local level, which basically highlights a challenge not only with the poor quality of finance, but also with the poor quantity of finance. And so this raises a key question around the importance of why we need to increase finance for locally led climate action and change the existing delivery mechanisms and instruments in a way that allows for a gender responsive and socially inclusive approach. And therefore, this tells us that unlocking finance for climate action should be a priority, especially when it comes to building resilience for vulnerable and under-resourced communities. It's also important to note that sustainable and equitable adaptation solutions should be anchored from the bottom up and locally led, whereby these initiatives are able to demonstrate an understanding of local climate impacts within local contexts. So the question is, what are some of the challenges that are affecting the decentralization, not only of finance, but of power at the local level, which is quite important to realize effective locally led climate action? One of which includes the systemic social and political barriers very much tied to structural imbalances. Second barrier includes administrative constraints, mostly tied to, in certain cases, reporting requirements, among other things, applications and so on. Another constraining barrier is related to capacity. And this is often not only at the local level, but also at the subnational, national, and also at the donor level. And then there's also the issue of the low quantity of finance, which is persistent and issue which effectively calls for the need to ramp up and scale up climate finance. And then there's also the issue of poor quality of climate finance, where climate finance is continuously riddled by high transactional costs that are very much affected by, at the same time, high compliance costs. And I think in the discourse in thinking about climate finance in general, I think we often focus a lot on the flow of finance very much from the national level to the international level. And I think there's also, in building a more robust society, an inclusive society, a functional market economy, I think it's important for us to also continuously think about what are some of the traditional barriers to access to traditional finance. And a lot of these could be categorized from economic barriers, technological barriers, as well as social barriers that continuously affect access to finance at the community level. And so the question becomes, there are growing instruments and perhaps initiatives and mechanisms of late that are showing how finance could reach the local level. And obviously we have different mechanisms stretching from public through to private, through to civil society-led. In certain cases, we've got hybrid mechanisms where we've got a potential funding mechanism that looks at an integration of civil society as well as government-led. And then, key to this is also the important recognition, and I think this is very important, is that finance is a key ingredient to realizing effective locally led climate action. It is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to realizing effective locally led adaptation. And this brings us to a very key topic around the importance of other factors that support effective channeling of climate finance. And many of you have probably heard of the 8 principles of locally led adaptation, which are very important. And they mainstream a couple of key factors, key considerations, stretching from the need to devolve power, within the structures that finance flows, the need to talk about and address, key structural inequalities, marginalization of ethnic groups, inclusion of, disabled people in financing decisions and so on. And so I'll proceed here to just cite a few examples, and many of you have seen these principles. But what is very important here is to note that there are some key examples that have actually worked through integrating some of these principles. And the importance of, integrating, or rather, leveraging decentralized decision-making helps integrate local adaptation into existing planning processes, promoting durable and, and the whole of society adaptation. I just want to point out that I'm just going to rush through these, some of these examples, but for those that are interested, you could have a look at some of the work that we've done in collaboration with WRI and IIED on, paper focusing on locally led adaptation from, principles to practice that distills and provides a very clear understanding of how some of these principles could be integrated in funding mechanisms. And also, important to this, session as well is the need to address structural inequalities. In this particular case, we're talking about the issue of gender. And a simple example is the Palanca Fund, integrates equity considerations in eligibility or selection criteria to ensure that the inclusion, of marginalized groups is observed. I'll jump on to the next principle, which talks about the need for patient and predictable funding. I think this is very, very important for a lot of funding projects and mechanisms, and we've seen this through a number of projects that there have been conversations around the need to have project preparatory facilities when looking at the adaptation projects, because you spend half of the time seeking to set up systems and and due diligence compliance, which effectively affects the time frame within which you're expected to monitor and evaluate some of the key results we expect to see from various locally led initiatives. Obviously, there's also a need to invest in local capabilities that leave an institutional legacy. And a simple example is in the Grant Chow product, which has established early flood warning systems. And the benefit of this is that through investing in local capabilities, we're able to build intuitively an adaptive capacity at scale. And then there's also a need to build robust understanding of climate risk as well. And there are several examples, as I cited in the study earlier on. And obviously, last but not least, there's a need to engage in more flexible programming and learning. I think the learning aspect becomes very important, because one of the key challenges that we are observing, especially around many of the funding mechanisms that are emerging, is the need to scale up. And obviously this learning across regions, across countries becomes very important and imperative to achieving more centralized and sort of global climate action. Totally forgot that we had another two principles. This is how complex this topic is, and the need to account for a number of things, right? And so the issue of transparency and accountability remains crucial. And lastly, the need to have a collaborative action, and investment sort of a framework, and that becomes crucial. Now, having provided this sort of context, it gives us a bit of an idea on, how complex and widespread, the need to unlock, finance for local-led climate action is. And so I would like to move on to introduce our fantastic panelists for this event. And, but first of all, I'd like to thank them for taking the time to join us here. This event has effectively been enabled because they took the time to come and sit here with us. And the more important thing as well is that they offer a diverse range of perspectives to unlocking climate finance, stretching from the NGO sector through to the investor, sort of side of the finance spectrum. And also, please note, as Shanaz mentioned earlier on, that one of our esteemed panelists speaks Spanish, so we'll have some Spanish interpretation at some point. So I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our first panelist, Ms. Suzanne Nandudu, who is the Executive Director of the African Center for Trade and Development, where she has held this position since 2015. Until then, she has served over a year as a board member of the African Center for Trade and Development. She is a development practitioner who has worked in various developmental issues, including sustainable transport, good governance, climate change adaptation, green cities, and the like. She previously worked on an as an independent consultant and a staff member of the Development Network for Indigenous Voluntary Associations. Please join me in welcoming Susan to this panel.
Thank you for having me.
So I'll actually go straight into the thick of things, and perhaps we can get started. I think that the plan would be to introduce each panelist, of course, followed by a question, just to also get to hear from them immediately, and also just to, to kind of get the conversation going. And so, Susan, this question is very much directed to you. What do you see as the biggest challenge of getting finance into the hands of local communities?
Thank you for the question. Okay, is the mic fine? Good. So I'd like to reflect, starting from the global level all the way down on, in responding to your question. So in 2009, I was on the streets of Copenhagen with other climate activists. And one of our demands at the time was we want new and additional finance to address climate change. And in that same conference, the presidents, as you know, announced the $100 billion pledge. And with the recent OECD data, we know that they have never fully delivered that amount. By 2020, we know that they've managed as a global north to mobilize 83.3 billion US dollars. $28.6 billion went to adaptation, less than the 50-50 agreement that, or decision that we are looking for. And very painfully is that most of that money is delivered as loans. Now, as a person that comes from a least developed country, I know that the format of loans does not really help with the communities that are very poor and are very vulnerable, and we know the justice issue that is related to that. But the flip side to that, in view of availability of finance, is the access part of it. That you have, Samson presented a very good picture there that shows how difficult it is for those at the local level to access the finance. The complexity with which the available finance is so difficult for people at the local community to access. And I'll just give you an example. I come from Uganda, and in 2019, we managed to have direct access. We went through the complex process of accreditation with the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. Took so many years, but we are in 2022, we have not yet got a coin through any of those. And why is that? There's lots of complexities that many of you know about. So our capacities to meet these obligations, even just passing the due diligence, is a challenge. So there are the barriers that you presented, Samson, are real. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that very sort of insightful response to the question around the challenges, and I absolutely agree that yeah, definitely it's quite challenging when you think about loans in general and poor households, and I think this speaks to what I talked about earlier on around. Sorry. Yeah, so this speaks to what I spoke about earlier on, particularly around the barriers to traditional finance. Now, these issues are quite important, and there's a need for innovation and to view particularly financial inclusion among low-income households, right, and find mechanisms of including them into the broader financial system. Moving on to our next speaker, panelists, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce Ms. Nivedita Mani, who's the Action Research and Communication Lead of Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group. Nivedita is essentially a development professional with over 19 years of experience in the environmental sector. She leads the African Research and Communications Initiative of Gorakhpur Environmental Action Group. She has worked with several national and international organizations on rural and urban climate change resilience, integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in development planning, ecosystems-based resilience, water and sanitation, sustainable livelihoods, and gender. She has been the author of several process documents, research reports, research papers, training manuals, and so on. She has more than 30 publications to her name or to her credit. Please welcome me, or rather join me in welcoming Nivedita to this panel.
Thank you so much.
Nivedita, I probably have a similar question for you, such as the one I posed for Susan. I think Susan did a good job in providing an African perspective, and it would be lovely to hear from you, particularly from, given your experience working in India and South Asia, to ideally give us a sense of what are some of the biggest challenges of getting finance into the hands of the communities. And perhaps you could also proceed to talk about, ideally, what is not working in this regard. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Samson, and thank you all for having me here. Yes, I come from India, and the challenges that we are facing in India are quite similar to what Susan talked about from the African perspective. In India, the lowest development unit of development that we have is called as village, and a cluster of villages put together is also called as Gram Panchayat, which in English we call it as village institutions, village level institution for the planning and development of villages. So what's happening is that the villages in India across are affected and impacted by climate change impacts. The problem is that though they know that they are being impacted by climate change, but they do not know the adaptation or the coping mechanisms of it, that what needs to be done or how they can deal with this kind of problem. So they are much aware of the impacts, but what needs to be done is something that they don't know, or maybe they are less aware about it. And once they are less aware about it, the entire development mechanism is also in the hands of the villages only. So they are not able to plan the development interventions from a climate or from a disaster risk reduction lens, and hence the finances also don't flow in from that point of view. For instance, I'll take one example that if there is an excessive rainfall and some waterlogging situations in the villages, they really don't know how to save their crops from that. What are the alternative resilient agriculture practices that they can adopt? And that kind of an education or that kind of awareness is lacking in the village community. So that there lies the problem. On the other hand, the solution givers like the government bodies or the other institutions who are providing the solutions, they are not very climate literate as of now. So there is a mismatch there again. So this is the biggest challenge that is actually hindering the whole flow of resilient resources for the village development. And many a times the mechanism of development or how the development intervention is being implemented is not very pro-adaptive in nature. It actually many a times works against adaptation and becomes like a maladaptation practice. So how the development interventions are being planned, how they should be planned so that they are pro-resilient, that's something which is lacking, because of which the resources are also not being able to mobilize that way. So I will stop here, Samson, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Nivedita, for providing us with an intuitive, Indian and South Asia perspective. And obviously from, Susan's reflections, we are continuously seeing some commonalities in some of these challenges. Obviously, I'll come back to you a little later to also talk a little bit about, what approaches are actually working, or rather, should I say, innovative approaches. But now, I'm going to take the opportunity of introducing our next speaker, Ms. Olga Galindo, who's the Executive Director of Vicuenca Corporation. And please pardon me for any mispronunciations of any Spanish words. I took a crash course this morning in trying to pronounce some of these words, so bear with me. Yeah. So Ms. Olga Galindo is the Executive Director of the Vivo Cuenca Corporation Water Fund for the Chinchina River Basin in Caldas, Colombia. She has served as the head of planning for the Western Andes Territorial Directorate of the National System of Natural Parks in Colombia. She's also a consultant to the Ministry of the Environment and Sustainable Development, and also a coordinator of the Department System of Protected Areas incorporate in Caldas Territorial Environmental Authority. Olga has been the director of several civil society organizations and provided technical assistance to the International Center for the Investigation of the El Nino phenomenon in regional programs in Latin America. She holds a medical degree in zoo technician and veterinary medicine, and a master's degree in regional development in territory planning. Please join me in welcoming Olga to the panel. Yeah. So, a question for you, Olga, very much focused on the Colombian Water Fund, which is effectively a sustainable, long-term and locally owned and led financial mechanism in the water sector in Colombia, and more broadly, in Latin America and other parts of the world. So my question to you is around, could you tell us a bit more around the key elements in the Water Fund mechanism to unlock finance?
¿Ahí escuchan? Sí. Los fondos de agua son mecanismos que se han venido trabajando en diversas partes del país, en Colombia y Latinoamérica. Y de por sí el concepto de los fondos de agua arroja dos elementos que son muy claves para desbloquear las finanzas locales. El primero es que la figura es una figura a largo plazo. ¿Eso qué significa? Que yo voy a poder tener unas acciones planificadas. Estas acciones planificadas las voy a poder implementar en los territorios o en donde puedo tener resultados mucho más eficientes. Y tercero, me permite monitorear. Digamos que eso rompe un poco como la forma de ejecutar proyectos en los territorios, y es que tienen cortos periodos, y al tener cortos periodos pues es muy difícil que se puedan alcanzar los objetivos que se plantean. Eso es lo primero. Lo segundo es que los fondos de agua permiten que de los recursos que se colecten anualmente, que la base de esos recursos es base local. Nosotros tenemos un fondo de agua en la cuenca Río Chinchiná que tiene recursos de las entidades territoriales, de la autoridad ambiental, de las empresas generadoras de energía a partir de agua, de la empresa prestadora del servicio de acueducto y de otras organizaciones locales. Entonces, digamos, ahí ya tenemos una base financiera, y en ese recurso nos permite que podamos capitalizar, es decir, ahorrar parte de ese recurso que nosotros recogemos anualmente, para que en los momentos en que tengamos discontinuidad en los aportes, pues podamos asegurar las intervenciones. Estos dos elementos, digamos que ya facilitan mucho la inversión. Ahora, hay otros, voy a dar un ejemplo de unos temas adicionales que nosotros hemos identificado en el territorio, que son muy útiles para que se puedan desbloquear estas finanzas, y es que en nuestro país, en Colombia, por ejemplo, hay una norma que dice que todos los gobiernos locales deben de destinar mínimo el 1% de los ingresos corrientes, es decir, de lo que reciben por impuestos o por servicios, los gobiernos locales deben destinar mínimo el 1% en inversiones ambientales. Eso como norma es una muy buena alternativa. Lo que sucede es que los gobiernos locales tienen poca capacidad para poder hacer esas inversiones de manera eficiente, primero porque las deben ejecutar en unos periodos muy cortos, y segundo porque esas destinaciones que pueden ser para compras de predios o para pagar incentivos a través de esquemas de pago por servicios ambientales, pues son insuficientes los recursos que tienen los gobiernos locales. Un fondo de agua, ¿qué hace? ¿O qué hacemos nosotros con este instrumento económico? Recogemos los recursos que pueden ser del 1%, le sumamos los recursos que tenemos de los otros aportantes, por tanto ampliamos esa base, lo que significa que podemos ejecutar y comprar predios, por ejemplo, o destinar esos recursos a los esquemas de pago por servicios ambientales que tienen que, o que su esencia, digamos, es tener compromisos a largo plazo. Como hay muchos ejemplos que los fondos de agua pueden ayudar facilitan la aplicación de estos instrumentos económicos que son de los recursos locales, como por ejemplo las compensaciones por pérdida de biodiversidad, o por ejemplo las exenciones del impuesto predial por conservación, y así digamos, tenemos muchas oportunidades en el territorio, pero que su ejecución es muy difícil hacerla directamente desde estos gobiernos.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olga. I think that was very insightful, and we got to learn more about the key elements of the water funding mechanism. I think one interesting thing that also stands out for me is, as you mentioned, I think the need for long-term financing is crucial. I think which speaks to one of the key principles of local adaptation, of ensuring that finance is predictable in order to realize effective locally led climate action. So thank you for that. I will now move on to our fourth panelist, Mr. Carl Aribebe, who is the Chief Operations Officer of the Environmental Investment Fund of Namibia. So Mr. Carl is a Namibian citizen with extensive experience in environmental and sustainable development issues. Having started his career in 1992, he holds 30 years of experience, during which he worked for national NGOs, international environmental NGOs, UN agencies, and the Namibian government. He is presently employed by the Environment Investment Fund of Namibia, where he has served as the Chief Operations Officer since 2013. Carl holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sociology from the University of Namibia and a Master's of Sciences degree in Integrating Conservation and Development Programs for the University of Wales. Please kindly welcome me and join me rather in welcoming Carl to this panel.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm not sure if he's really speaking about me.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. And so my question to you very much revolves around, a report that was published, last year in June, particularly, around your journey, or the journey of the Environmental Investment Fund with the Green Climate Fund, and including, particularly, a project under the Enhanced Direct Access pilot, which is titled Empower to Adapt, Creating Climate Change Resilient Livelihoods Through Community-Based Natural Resource Management in Namibia. So my question to you is basically, what stands out for you as a key reflection related to how communities can be empowered, particularly to lead their own adaptation initiatives? And also a second part to this question is, how has the EIF included gender, and social aspect, or rather, how have these been made a priority in, the programming, the financial programming in general? Over to you, Carl.
Thank you. Yeah, I come from Namibia. Sorry, I'm battling a sore throat, but I'll give it my my best. Yeah, I come from Namibia, a small country on the southwestern coast of Africa. I work for the EIF, Environmental Investment Fund, a state-owned entity only 10 years old now in its operations. And we've been implementing a project through GCF's Enhanced Direct Access window, the project that is actually concluding by end of this month, for which we'll be doing terminal evaluation early next year. This project has basically ticked all the boxes, in our opinion, of what a locally led adaptation action would represent, at least in the context of our country. The project, again, has been programmed against the backdrop of a very supportive and very enabling national legal framework, and also a very strong community-level institutional base. So in my country, the issue, the sector of environmental management and rural development has been democratized. We call it democratized, but it's been devolved way back in 1996, that by the time we were programming this project, we found ready-made self-governing community-level institutions that were already managing and benefiting from wildlife, forestry, water, and tourism rights for close to 20 years by then. So we found a local self-governing institutions that we could work with. And there was also a network of civil society stakeholders who were in good partnership, supporting partnership with the government as well as the CBOs. So we basically joined a moving bandwagon when we started programming this project. We also found, by the time we started, a very recent national level, but fairly decentralized vulnerability assessment report. By then dated 2011 and has since been updated 2018, which basically looked at different regions. What are the climate change threats that local communities within the areas of these CBOs are experiencing, and what are the options that they have identified, basically in collaboration with the government. And the package that we developed for this Enhanced Direct Access project basically looked at taking low-hanging fruits from the threats, the most serious threats that were identified, and most responses, adaptation responses to those threats. And the structure of that project was, although in GCF terms, EDA devolves decision-making to the national level under the leadership of nationally designated authorities. We took the step lower to sub-national level, where the CBOs basically determined, okay, we want to access this pot of money to address this need. We've determined it ourselves, and we want to manage some of the financing ourselves. So we were able to provide funding directly to the CBOs. Many of them surprisingly demonstrated enough capacity to receive, hold, and account for funding, while some needed a bit of a support from both our office, the government, and also civil society partners. So in that respect, we are very aware that not many countries have that level of devolution and democratization when it comes to CBOs and decision-making in responding to environmental and climate change challenges, but that's the environment under which Namibia implemented this GCF investment. When it comes to gender responsiveness, we also collaborated very closely with University of Namibia, went out, basically look at these adaptation options that were identified in the vulnerability assessment report, but we took these options to the regions and then use the researchers and specialists from the university to interrogate the communities. How do these challenges affect, how do they unfold themselves from the gender perspective, and came up with a report called Gender, Natural Resources Management and Climate Change in Namibia, and concluded with a national level workshop, again working with the university, that was called Gender and Climate Change, and all this basically informed environmental investment funds, gender mainstreaming tools, which we find extremely useful in our programming in terms of factoring regional diversities, local diversities, cultural diversities, and challenges that are being experienced in local areas as we are trying to respond to threats of climate change in Namibia. So that's the journey that we have took, and that's also the journey that the report you referred to is seeking to address partially.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, for that very exciting response. I think it's really interesting and intriguing to see the devolution of power and finance to the local level in practice. I very much appreciate how you went ahead to sort of clearly indicate that the devolution of power and finance goes beyond a participatory approach. Rather, it includes taking into account the needs of the local communities. I think you talked about how you had the CBOs indicate what their initial financial priorities were, and these were taken on board. And I think this was quite interesting, and it's good to see these kind of mechanisms. I think while we're still talking about more or less approaches that work, I would like to direct basically the next question to Nivedita. I think initially we spoke about what were some of the challenges with getting finance at a local level, but perhaps you could also go ahead and give us a sense of what approaches and mechanisms are actually working for getting finance to the local level. And if possible, you can also talk about how innovative some of these approaches are, also if possible. So over to you, Nivedita.
Thanks, Samson. Slide. Can I have? Okay. So, regarding the approaches and the mechanisms that have worked, as I was talking earlier, that in India we have this whole system of village development planning system, and every village institution is mandated to develop their own annual plans and allocate resources, which are hence approved later by the higher authorities for all the development interventions in the village. So this involves a whole lot of a step-by-step procedure to do that, and there are basically 5 steps involved in sort of formulating these development plans. So as you can see, the first step, which is on the creation of environment, wherein what we do is that the village communities across all sections, in fact, all the vulnerable communities, be it women section or the elderly, the disabled, children, and the poor and vulnerable, all the communities come together, and they sort of assess the needs of the village and look at what is required in terms of development from a climate and a disaster lens. So that kind of thing, their own self-development, self-village development planning starts from there. And they also try to see what kind of resources they will need to sort of cater to these kind of development interventions. The second step is a situational analysis, wherein the communities themselves do this hazard, risk, vulnerability, and capacity assessment to identify the risks, the kind of climate risks that their villages are facing, so that they are able to again plan development interventions in a way that are resilient and also allocate resources. The third is, of course, what are the needs, the prioritization of the needs and the needs of the communities, basically, that is done, wherein the capacity enhancement takes place, and how the communities can reduce their vulnerabilities, those kind of things are identified, and the development interventions are prioritized by the communities themselves. The fourth and the most important step is identifying the resources. What kind of resources are needed for this kind of climate and disaster resilient development interventions at the village level, wherein, and there are variety of, I would say there are a range of sources of these resources in India. There is the State Finance Commission, from where the village for the village development they get the funds. They also generate their own funds by maintaining the water bodies or the plantation area, which is called as own source revenue. And there are other corporate social responsibility schemes as well, from where these village development institutions can mobilize or leverage funds for the village development. So on the basis of this, so it's like a bottom-up approach wherein they assess their own risk at the village level, they plan the development interventions, and then the allocation of funds are also done in that way, and then the funds are hence approved by the higher authorities. So it's this is one of the mechanisms that we have promoted in one of the states in India, that is called as Uttar Pradesh, which is in the northern region of the country, wherein we have tried to integrate climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in the village development planning processes. So this is how we have seen that this model now is being increasingly adopted by all the other states as well in India, wherein the development at the village level is being looked at from the disaster and climate lens, and the fund allocations are sort of being made by the villages themselves accordingly. So one of the approaches that we have implemented, Samson, is this. I'll be happy to answer any question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nivedita. I think that was extremely useful to hear more intuitively about, some of these funding mechanisms and approaches. I think while we're still talking about approaches, I would like to quickly move on to Olga. So this next question is directed towards you. And I think you had touched a little bit on this, particularly around the approaches the Water Fund, integrates, or rather works on in the context of local-led adaptation. But I think it would be good for you to expand a little bit more on that, and if you can also talk about how some of these approaches include or integrate a gender equity and social inclusive perspective. Over to you.
Gracias. Yo primero quisiera hacer énfasis en algo, y es que nuestro fondo de agua tiene una característica particular, y es que tenemos como ámbito geográfico la cuenca hidrográfica. Al tener como ámbito geográfico la cuenca hidrográfica, significa que tenemos total coherencia con el instrumento de planificación que se define para la cuenca por norma. En el país debemos de tener un instrumento de planificación que se llama Plan de Ordenación y Manejo de la Cuenca Hidrográfica. Entonces nuestras actuaciones todas tienen un enfoque hacia este instrumento de planificación. Digamos que ese es el instrumento que nos direcciona. Lo segundo que me parece que es importante que destaquemos es que nuestra experiencia se deriva de la conformación de un esquema de gobernanza que venimos trabajando en el territorio desde hace más o menos unos 10 años. Este esquema de gobernanza que se llama Pactos por la Cuenca del Río Chinchiná está conformado, está representado por los diversos sectores del territorio. Allí está el sector privado, allí está el sector público, están las organizaciones locales, están las organizaciones nacionales, están organizaciones internacionales. Y este esquema de gobernanza derivó en este instrumento financiero que es el Fondo de Agua, que soporta entonces las decisiones o los acuerdos a los que se llegan en Pactos por la Cuenca, que es como el escenario de discusión del cómo debemos implementar y cómo nos ponemos de acuerdo para llevar a cabo tareas conjuntas en el territorio. Entonces, digamos que hay un primer elemento de inclusión alrededor de nuestro ejercicio. Lo tercero que yo quisiera destacar es que nuestras intervenciones, nosotros somos un fondo de agua, pero nuestras intervenciones no están supeditadas a acciones de restauración, por ejemplo, es decir, no se refiere solo a que estemos sembrando árboles. Nosotros tenemos un componente que llamamos compromiso ciudadano e institucional con la sostenibilidad del territorio, y allí, entre otras actividades, lo que hacemos es que trabajamos mucho con comunidades, con sociedad civil, con dos, digamos, líneas de trabajo. Una es generándoles capacidades, haciendo transferencia de conocimientos de la norma ambiental, de los mecanismos de participación. Y segundo, mejorar esa capacidad de incidencia en el territorio. Esto lo hacemos a través de diversas estrategias. Por ejemplo, tenemos una estrategia que son los viveros comunitarios. Nosotros todo el material o la mayoría del material que sembramos tratamos de que provenga de los viveros que nosotros mismos estamos promoviendo. Estos viveros pueden ser de una organización o de una asociación, o pueden ser de alguna persona, pero pues que habita en el territorio, de campesinos que habitan en el territorio de la cuenca. Y esto, además de que se convierte en una opción financiera o económica para esta persona o para esta asociación, pues nos ayuda a que todos entendamos de que debemos de ser corresponsables de las acciones sobre el territorio. Eso para nosotros es muy importante. Tenemos otro mecanismo que recién estamos implementando, que se llama Conexión Bosque. Conexión Bosque pretende conectar a una empresa privada o a una empresa que financia, hace de padrino de un bosque, nos entrega un dinero para un apadrinamiento de un cierto número de árboles. Nosotros desde Vivocuenca hacemos un aporte similar o mayor a ese aporte que estamos recibiendo de esta empresa. Y además de que hacemos entonces todo lo que significa la siembra y el mantenimiento de estos árboles, vinculamos a una comunidad, vinculamos a un colectivo ambiental. Este colectivo ambiental adquiere una responsabilidad con nosotros, no con el territorio, y esa responsabilidad es de hacer guardián de ese bosque que sembramos con los recursos que nos están entregando. Ellos entonces se hacen cargo de hacer el seguimiento de los árboles que se siembran, hacer el monitoreo, determinar cuál es la mortalidad, determinar en dónde se deben hacer resiembras. Es decir, ellos van a ser como esos guardianes de este ejercicio. Y un tercero que me gustaría destacar es que venimos trabajando con varias comunidades tratando de avanzar hacia lo que es el monitoreo comunitario, que ellos sean quienes estén colectando la información en territorio, que brinda los datos que nos permiten a nosotros determinar si las acciones que nosotros estamos implementando en realidad están siendo efectivas en términos de que estoy mejorando el recurso hídrico, de que estoy mejorando la biodiversidad a través de mejorar conectividad y de que estoy mejorando además calidad de vida porque estoy mejorando los servicios ecosistémicos que necesitamos o que tenemos en el territorio. Entonces estas comunidades se están preparando para eso. Por ahora tenemos grupos de observadores de aves, tenemos grupos que se están capacitando en identificar macroinvertebrados, por ejemplo, como indicadores de calidad de agua. Y así lo que queremos es ir ampliando estos grupos o esta información que ellos nos van a ir entregando y ampliando esta participación de estas comunidades de manera que ellos sean quienes a nosotros nos estén brindando la información. Y eso vuelve a ser un elemento que les permite hacerse responsables de su territorio, no solamente sujetos de derechos, sino también sujetos de obligaciones ambientales en su territorio.
Thank you, Olga, for those, kind of insightful, details to, some of the approaches of incorporating locally led, action in, in terms of the water funds approaches. And so, I think, what, strikes me is that it's actually, very much a multi-stakeholder process and so many moving parts in order to realize locally led climate action. And it's, I think it's very interesting that you touched on a number of these things and particularly how, it accounts or integrates, key issues around gender and social inclusion. And now, while we're still talking about the approaches, I think I will move on quickly to Susan. My question is around, it would be interesting if you could give us perhaps one inspiring example of, how finance, is channeled to the local level.
Thank you. I'd like to speak to an example that we are implementing as a country as part of the LDC vision to turn around the 10% of finance going to the local level to 70%. An ambitious goal, right? So the Least Developed Country Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience, LIFE-AR, is an initiative of the LDC that is being piloted in 6 countries to achieve that goal. So in Uganda, we are implementing it, and it is taking on the whole of society approach, really a good example of integrating the locally led adaptation principles. What we are at the early stages, early phases of implementing this, and it is for now a 10-year initiative where we know, or the finance is predictable. The design that is being undertaken is involving academia, government at the central level, and civil society. We still have the challenge of bringing private sector on board, especially at this design stage, but we think that as we roll out and reach the level of investments, they'll be incentivized to be a part of the process. And so it's being, the government has chosen to use the decentralized climate fund mechanism. And I'm happy to hear that it is working very well in the Namibia. Again, for us in our country also, we have a decentralized system. It may not be working as well as it was for you in Namibia, but this mechanism is triggering the same to deliver finance. And so far, the design is to bring on board the 4 core elements of the fund mechanism, which is looking at the planning stage that brings on board the women, the youth, the persons with disability, everybody at the front lines to bring the ideas of what investments are needed and are of priority for funding. And it has the component of knowledge and risks, which equally integrates the risk assessments as well as building capacities for the stakeholders at the local level to engage very actively in identifying these priorities. And the priorities are not really going at the household level, but we're looking at public goods that help support building the resilience of the communities where they work. And importantly is an element of monitoring, evaluation, and learning that engages everybody within the communities. And so where we are now as a country is that through a very elaborate process that involved an objective criteria, we've identified 12 districts, 12 local governments where this is going to be piloted. And we are moving into a stage of building the capacities of the local government staff to engage with the process and start mobilizing and engaging the communities that are vulnerable based on this assessment. So while we might be at the beginning phase, I really see that our example is linked with Carl's example of Namibia. And we are looking at this as an opportunity to also hopefully utilize more actively our national implementing entity. And I'm so happy the official that helped our government to get this accreditation has walked into this room, and you're welcome, James, to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I think that was very, very interesting, and it's also very nice to learn that there are potential synergies and commonalities with some of the work that the EIF are doing, and I think this also continuously speaks to some of the principles of local-led adaptation, and specifically around collaboration and learning, and obviously there are opportunities to learn and to kind of reinforce our understanding of local-led climate action. I'll actually quickly turn to Carl. To talk a bit more, about the EIF and specifically, during the pandemic, your organization set up, the Conservation Relief Recovery and Resilient Facility to aggregate contributions from a broad range of actors to invest in community-based resilience. Now, it'd be nice for you if you could, kind of reflect on this step to act as an aggregator of funds for basically the impact and how a locally led approach was possible through governance structures that the EIF would have set up.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, CRRF, as we called it at home, it was really a very transformative response that EIF has initiated. I had to, in the interest of time, be very conservative with my description of the sheer size, impact, and the success of Namibia's National Community-Based Natural Resources Management Program. It's a program that has established very strong CBO foundation in the most remote areas, 83 CBOs registered, and with all humility, Namibian government way back in 1996 took a decision that we do the government structures decentralization up to constituencies and villages level. That's how government will decentralize. But then for the management of environment and natural resources, they created a law that says if you define a geographic area as a CBO, if you define your membership a geographic area and convince the government that you can manage yourself without our interference, we will devolve rights, certain rights to you to manage your environment. That was very unprecedented at that stage, and also fairly radical as we speak. Slightly different from decentralization and devolution of government structures, but it's total devolution to non-state entities' rights and responsibilities to manage and benefit from the natural environment. So those are the CBOs that we found ready-made to deliver locally led adaptation funding for them to address within their membership bases and within the geographic areas they have been registered for. With the advent of COVID, tourism being the major source of income for these CBOs, overnight that source of income dried up. But in the meantime, lot of climate change funding that EIF and the government personally leveraged were invested in those areas that would basically come to complete standstill. So EIF brought a number of stakeholders around the table and put a small envelope on the table and said, colleagues, stakeholders, do you also see the threat that we see, that if guys who are looking after the black rhino are unable to do their patrols, for example, if guys are monitoring climate change impacts on the local level no longer are able to go out and do their readings, weather readings and those, we are facing a problem. So to keep things going during the lockdowns, we are putting so much on the table. How much are you prepared to put on the table? So many stakeholders used the EIF's leverage and put quite a substantial amount of resources on the table that kept the program going during those difficult times, protected the investments that were leveraged through various development partners, including the GCF, and managed to save the national CBNM program to the point that it was able to rebound with minimal impact last year. Some jobs have been lost, but not to the degree that it would have been lost had there been no intervention. So this is, it has taken care of and protected some climate change adaptation interventions, but it has also saved massive biodiversity protection interventions that Namibian government had started way back in early 1990s, and EIF was just a catalyst in this whole arrangement. I'm happy to discuss that with the colleagues at some other stage, but that's what CRRF was, and then EIF basically used its financial management and delivery infrastructure that we have up to the most remote area to be delivering the financial resources and then support services that came during the COVID lockdowns.
Thank you very much, Carl. And I think, one thing that was quite interesting to hear was, when you talked about scaling locally led adaptation. And while I still have you, I've got a very quick follow-up question around if we were to assume, that direct access is important for scaling up locally led climate action, how would we grow the opportunities for other entities in order for them to succeed at channeling, climate finance? If you could just briefly comment on that, that would be good.
Yeah, with the support of our government, we really believe that other arrangements of accessing climate change funding should be seen as interim arrangements. But the ultimate arrangement is direct access. As many as possible national direct access entities being support each other at regional scale, maybe at continental scale, to meet the requirements of various funding entities to be able to access climate change adaptation funding directly. In our humble efforts, we are, as EIF, playing a critical role, collaborating with other partners in the Southern Africa region, in a network that SSN plays a critical role under, but also at bilateral level. This year alone, we've hosted aspiring entities from Eswatini twice, Botswana, our neighboring countries, Botswana, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, and also Angola. Personally, I worked with Angolan NDAs personally, looking at how one can advise them and support them to access climate change funding directly. So that is something that EIF is very passionate about, and that is something that our government has taken a principled stance about, that funding should be accessed directly. Entities must support each other at whatever level they need to support each other to have a groundswell of national entities around to access and deliver funding locally.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'll quickly, in the interest of time, I'll quickly turn to Olga. And, I think very interesting conversations. Probably my final question to you. I think it would be interesting if you could just quickly or briefly, comment on, some of the innovative opportunities, to finance local-led, action within, the Water Fund. Speaking about, for instance, blended finance among other instruments and mechanisms. Thank you.
Yo creo que aquí hay algo que se destaca, y es que los fondos de agua brindan la oportunidad de tener recursos mixtos en un solo lugar, es decir, nosotros tenemos recursos privados, recursos públicos en una sola bolsa. Eso facilita que además se consoliden y que puedan servir de contraparte para poder tener recursos de cooperación, por ejemplo. Nosotros tenemos algunos proyectos de cooperación que nos exigen que tengamos, o que el requerimiento para que nos puedan llegar recursos sea que tengamos que garantizar $3 por cada dólar que nos llega de cooperación. Eso no lo lograríamos de no ser porque hacemos parte de este colectivo y que entre el colectivo se recogen todos los recursos para poder garantizar esas contrapartes. Eso, digamos que para nosotros ha sido pues supremamente exitoso poder tener esa oportunidad. Creo que también tener a la comunidad como aportante en especie, siendo, como les decía previamente, como corresponsables de las actividades en el territorio. Esto también se convierte en un escenario que genera confianza frente a posibles inversiones adicionales o inversionistas adicionales para nuestro fondo de agua. Yo creo que hay elementos que pueden ser muy innovadores al respecto. Y por último, yo destacaría, y también lo mencioné previamente, la posibilidad que tienen los fondos de agua de operar recursos que provienen de instrumentos económicos existentes, pero que su operación es muy compleja. Y ahí yo creo que los fondos, no solo Vivo Cuenca, sino todos los otros fondos de agua han podido y han sabido aprovechar esta oportunidad de operar estos recursos, además generándole a los territorios unos escenarios de confianza, porque finalmente los fondos de agua pues actúan con total transparencia en estas inversiones. La inversión respecto a lo que se recibe de los fondos de agua, en el caso nuestro es, nosotros por cada 100 pesos que recibimos guardamos 5 para el ahorro que les decía, y los otros 95 van directamente a inversión ambiental en el territorio. Es decir, aquí no hay un porcentaje de administración y eso pues hace que sea mucho más efectiva las inversiones. Yo creo que estos son como las oportunidades que nosotros, algunas de las oportunidades que nosotros hemos podido aprovechar en el territorio y que hemos identificado que nos han dado unos resultados muy interesantes y que por tanto han hecho que gracias a esto pues tengamos apoyos adicionales a los que empezamos a tener hace 5 años. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Olga. Yeah, that was very, very useful. I'll quickly turn to Nivedita, and my final question to you is essentially, what would you like to see from the donor community, from government, and from the private sector, in as far as finance for local-led climate action is involved? If you can just provide a 30 to 60-second response, that would be good.
Sure. Thanks, Samson. So, one of the things that we expect or we want from the private sector in India basically is that the private sector needs to understand how they can support the resilience and the adaptation agenda. That kind of an understanding is still a bit lacking, what we have seen so far. And their literacy on climate change is very low, or I mean the ground realities, or how the climate actions can be localized, those kind of things we find it a little missing there. In India, we also have the something called as corporate social responsibilities, which is basically a huge potential funding resource and a source which can be tapped and leveraged for climate action. So that is something that we would like to see, that the corporate companies through their CSR funding come forward for the resilience and adaptation agenda for localizing climate actions. And one more thing that we want to see is that the finance, which is actually it's a money, I mean, it's not the money of today, but it's also something that is generated for future. Like if we invest in plantation, or if we invest in some water body related activities which can generate income, then that becomes the money for tomorrow as well, so the resource for tomorrow as well. So those kind of things also need to be promoted, and that kind of literacy needs to be sort of inbuilt in the stakeholders and at the community level, so that the funding, the flow of funds and climate finance is a little more smooth, and it goes where it has to go for the actual agenda. So just a few pointers from my side, Samson.
Thank you very much, Navadita. And my final question to Suzanne is, could you give a quick reflection also on what essentially needs to happen to catalyze and scale climate finance for locally led climate action? If you can do that in 30 seconds to a minute, that would be great.
Come on, Sam. Well, thank you for the question. I first wanted to point out that with the Life AR, the delivery channel, at the moment, we have an interesting mechanism where an NGO, my NGO, is supporting the government to roll out the financing for Life AR. And in future, the plan is for the central government to receive the funds and then channel it to the local governments and down to the communities or to the public investments. What I think in relation to your point is we need to strengthen collaborations, and that will leverage the strengths that we have at the different levels. The example of Life AR, for example, shows how leveraging collaborations is attracting increased financing. We are at the moment working with universities across all the six countries to handle the capacity building elements. So we do not have to fly in consultants, but work with existing capacities. We are supported at the moment by IIED, mentioned here already, that is equally supporting at the global level to attract or mobilize the finance, which combined with the capacity building, we believe we are going to catalyze our capacities to access funds through the direct access channel that Carl here is speaking about. But bringing on board the communities that are on the ground, this collaboration does help build that journey of strengthening their capacities in financial management, in reporting, communications, etc. So working in silos will not work going forward. But I want to speak to the issue of the political decisions that we should expect from this place. For example, the finance should be increased. Very, very, very important. And there is need to expand the grant element. At least in the initial stages, we should see a lot more financing that is targeting adaptation. And if we can meet the 50% target that was already agreed to, that would be important. But very, very important, Simon. My thoughts have been a little scattered because of your few seconds to me, is to end with easing the conditions for accessing the finance. That is very critical to ensure that finance reaches the local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and my apologies once again for limiting your time. So this effectively concludes the few questions that I had, and please join me in applauding the panelists. Yeah. In the interest of time, I think what's an event without getting the opportunity to ask some questions, right? So I think we could take one round of questions, and there's also an opportunity to further engage with some of the panelists after the event. And so I open up the floor for questions, if any. Yes. There's no microphone. Do we have a microphone? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here. My name is Jared. I'm an observer here from the University of Michigan in the US. So I was curious to hear, and this is for anyone on the panel, if you feel that paternalistic questions of how effectively local communities will use climate funds are significant barriers to getting these funds out at the local level. And if so, how do you address this? And also, if so, if there's pressure to adapt projects to best fit the desires of the funders rather than doing what a community actually thinks is best, how you incorporate that into your strategies to help the communities as much as possible. Or have the communities be able to help themselves as much as possible.
I think we could have another question as well, Emma, just to bundle them, and then we could distribute them evenly to see who responds to what. Yeah, any other questions? There's also an opportunity to engage further with the panelists after this. And so, there's another question, Emma.
Thanks very much. That was really fascinating. My question is for Carl, I think, but I think it also relates to everyone else. I was interested in your reference to CBNRM in Namibia. And I think one of our lessons from many decades there was some of the challenges around governance of communal resources in particular. So I'm interested in how those lessons have evolved and what happens when finance gets put into that equation as well. And if you have any thoughts on that, thanks.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could, take some time to respond to that. Perhaps last question, Carl, would you want to take a stab at it?
Okay, yeah, I'll take that one. Through our investment, working with the government, we are able to place these CBOs on a continuum. Some with very high levels of skill and capacity and ability to run their own affairs, who actually needed to be left alone about 10 years ago, but still being handheld. And some who had so much turnover at the leadership level for so many reasons that needed to be stabilized. And then some where there were just too much issues of impunity because of people getting away with a few transgressions, and others who really meant well but who will never have the capacity to run their own affairs in my lifetime, like where the San and the Himba are involved because of historical lack of access to education and their choice to live the way they want. So we were able to separate apples from oranges and basically tailor our support accordingly. Where they were effectively non-compliant, one of the funding requirements was they need to be compliant with the ministry's compliance requirements, which mostly had to do with financial management rights. There was only one case out of 33 that an application was disqualified on that basis. But many of them, we were able to address governance issues. I don't want the world to single out CBOs for financial misdemeanors. The corporates are also not innocent with all the resources and expertise that they have.
Thank you very much, Carl. I must admit that we got a little carried away. I mean, this is how passionate we are around local-led, climate action, and I believe we're sort of running out of time. But the gentleman from the University of Michigan, I think we could also take this conversation, after we conclude this event and discuss a little bit further. I think Carl would also be in a good position to, respond, to your question, right? And so I would like to move on to, basically a very quick reflection and some key recommendations from Dr. Shiraz Waji, who's also the president of the Gorakpa Environmental Action Group, who are also the co-hosts of this event. Over to you, Dr. Shiraz.
Thank you, Samson. I'll be very brief. Actually, I know the limitation of the time that is also very limited. So some of the things actually which was emerging from the panelists while they were talking. One is that, there is a uniformity in terms of the challenges and the approaches in terms of managing the resources for the local adaptive actions. And whether it is Africa or it is Asia or it is Latin America, there are a lot of similarity in the challenges. One of the issue actually which I could, I wish to reflect here is also that risk and vulnerabilities are not homogeneous. And there is a lot of heterogeneity, that is coming across the panelists, that how this heterogeneity can be addressed for the locally adaptive actions and how the resources can be invested in a mechanism or in a way that it reaches to the most vulnerable communities. Vulnerable in terms of spatial location, gender, class, socioeconomic class, age, and so on. So that is also very important, which is coming again and again. The second point actually which I would like to reflect here is also that empowerment of the community is very important in terms of mobilizing the resources or investment of the resources, so that it is according to the local aspirations and the local priorities rather than top-down approach where a policy is made and an implementation mechanism is delivered to the local level. And the devolution of power is also mentioned by various panelists, that how devolution is important, so that the empowered community can break those barriers which Samson was mentioning earlier, the political boundaries or the administrative boundaries, the whole complexity of the resources which exist. So that is, if I take an example of the money which is available for insurance, it's a huge task for a small and marginal or the women farmer to take that claim of the insurance in any developing country. At least in India, that is the reality. If you go for the crop insurance or anything, it is a Herculean task to get that resource. The third point is how to make the resources resilient. And there the panelists also talked, Nimita also talked, and Susan, that how the development and resilient can be converged. And that is also very important for the local adaptive actions, that this convergence of development and resilient actions is very important. And we know a number of mechanisms where developmental resources have been invested in a way that it has not helped adaptation, but it has gone against the adaptation. So that has to be, as a caution for the investment and using the developmental resources. Public-private partnership is also quite important, and Nimita also mentioned about this whole CSR fund which is available, almost 2.5% of the benefits or the profits which has to be invested. So the private investment have to be made in a way that it helps adaptation and resilience rather than exploiting the resources and the natural ecosystems. The fourth point here will be that there is a lot of opportunity of generating resources. So not only depending on the outside resources, but also generating resources. And this is also in terms of long-term, what Olga was mentioning, that is a long-term solution is also very important. So resource investment is not only for the direct resilient action, but it also supports kind of long-term solution and the long-term action. And number of mechanisms are available where a win-win situation is possible in the green growth of a village or a city and the resilient action. So the resource generation is also quite important in terms of the community empowerment. That is also one point which I would like to share here. And the last but one point is that the complementarity of the resources, what Carl was also mentioning and Susan also mentioned, is that how the complementarity of the resources for a common pool of actions which are required at the local level is very important, which comes across sectors both horizontally and vertically. So, I mean, it is not only the national level, but sub-national level, and ultimately coming down to the village level or the ward level or the city level. And at the same time, different sectors, they work together so that the cross-sectoral linkages are ensured. And finally, what I could hear is that resilient resources are not, they become if invested properly or appropriately. So thank you so much for very enriching experiences which was coming up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waji, for these enlightening reflections. And in closing, I would like to thank all our panelists for taking the time to joining us for this session. I think you've made this session highly enriching, sharing very diverse opinions and perspective, both across geography and scale. And I just want to say once again, really thank you for taking the time to join us. And for our esteemed audience, also thank you for coming to this session. I know there's so many things happening, and yeah, I'm glad that you were able to join us. And finally, for SN team that have spent a lot of time trying to put together this event, lots of back and forth. This is great work, and I'm glad that we managed to pull this off. If you can just raise your hands for the crowd to clap for you. And session is officially closed. Thank you, everyone.